I think George's gonna hit start soon.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to another ICTM webinar. I'm Annie Forrest and I'm ICTM board member, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's presentation. Before we start, I wanted to encourage you to become an ICTM board member if you aren't already. Sorry, not board member, but if you wanted to be a board member, we'd love to have you. But just an ICTM member. People being members is what allows us to bring you things like this webinar. And also, in addition, I wanted to let you know that registration is actually open for the NCTM Regional Conference. This year, it's going to serve as ICTM's annual conference. So in place of an annual conference for ICTM, we're all going to be participating in the NCTM Regional Conference, which takes place in Chicago. It's November 29th through December 1st, and we would love to have a large Illinois presence there. So think about attending. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. Graham Fletcher has worked in education for over 10 years as a classroom teacher, math coach, and he's currently a district math specialist. He graduated from the University of Georgia, where he earned a specialist degree in math education. Graham's passion for conceptual understanding through problem-based lessons has led him to present internationally and throughout the United States. He continues to be an advocate for best practice and a change agent for elementary mathematics. Personally, I learned about Graham through Twitter, and he also has a really amazing blog and some interesting progression videos about how students learn different concepts and make sense of mathematics, which really helped me as I started coaching K-5 teachers. So I'm a big edu fan, and I'm quite excited to hear what Graham has to say today. During the presentation, you can feel free to type questions. Other participants in the webinar will not be able to see your questions, but I'll be kind of consolidating them, jumping in during the webinar to pose them to Graham, or just maybe saving them for the end when he has some time for questions after his presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen over to Graham and let him get started.
Perfect, Annie. I appreciate it, and hello to all of my new friends up there in Illinois. I'll be up there at the regional, so hopefully all of our paths will cross and we'll get to meet each other and say hello in person. But yeah, so you don't need to look at my face. Let's kind of dive in and talk about this thing called mathematical modeling and what that looks like in an elementary classroom and beyond. So one of the things that I'm going to do today is as I talk about modeling, I'm going to talk about different ways that we can get kids and our students, whether it's in kindergarten, whether it's in middle school or even high school, how we can get kids to engage in this whole process of mathematical modeling, and what is mathematical modeling and how can we ensure that it's happening in our classroom. So one of the first things that brought my attention to this whole idea of mathematical modeling and three-act tasks is from the creator of them. And the creator of three-act tasks is Dan Meyer. Dan Meyer posed this question. I saw him during his TED Talk. He posed this question: how is it that we can be less helpful as classroom teachers? And for us, you know, I really struggled with this question because intuitively as a teacher, I want to help kids. I want to make sure that kids are successful. And then here's this guy that comes up out of the blue and says, hey, the way we help kids is by being less helpful. So at first I wasn't quite sure, but then I started thinking and reflecting on my own practice and what it means for me as a teacher to be less helpful. So I think about my time as a third grade teacher. I threw a problem like this up on the board. There was we were talking as a team, and the teacher came and said, hey, Graham, my class really struggles with this word problems. So we walk into the classroom, we put this problem up on the board. Joe had some playing cards in his bag. Ashley gave him 13 more cards. Joe now has 21 cards. How many cards does Joe have in his bag? So immediately I know, and the teacher knows, that this is going to be a different type of problem just because it doesn't have that result unknown where it's A plus B equals this unknown number. It's more of there's an unknown number, and what number plus that unknown number gives us 21. So I know that as the kids are out at recess and they walk back into the classroom, they immediately go into third grade tunnel vision. And so what they end up doing is they look at the problem, and immediately the context of the problem has completely disappeared. All they do is they look at those numbers. And so immediately the context is gone. They look at the numbers. The first thing that comes to our mind is, you little plucker. But hang on here. Let me clarify this. I heard this term from John Sangiovanni when I was at the regional last year in Philadelphia. And what John was doing is he's talking about number pluckers. Whether you're a first grade teacher or you're a 10th grade teacher, what we have students that just look at problems, get those numbers, and try and take those numbers away from the problems, and it just becomes a crapshoot. Well, if you're a first grade or a second grade teacher, there's probably going to be a good chance that kids are going to be right 50% of the time, assuming that their math is right, because they can add or subtract. The problem is when they get into third grade, their 50% becomes 25%, because they don't only just have addition and subtraction, we now introduce multiplication and division. And by the time they leave us in elementary school and they get to middle school, well, now they don't even get the numbers, we give it to them as variables. So we know this. And so we know that there's this conflict, and it happens in almost every classroom that I've ever been in, and every teacher's room that I've ever worked with. There's this internal conflict going on inside our math classrooms, and it's between the context of the problem and the quantities of the problem. And as much as we as the teachers want to fight that students understand the context and what we're talking about, a lot of the times what happens is that students only ever focus on the quantities. So we knew this. The teacher and I had talked about this. So when the class actually came back in and they looked at the problem, they walked in to this right here. If you want to tick off a bunch of students, take away the one thing that you know that they want. And even more so, they walked into this. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds here. What types of things, like what types of questions do you think your kids might go ahead and start asking you as they look at this? We can't use the chat window, but just take a couple seconds. When we take away all of these pieces of information, what might that force our students to do? So just in past with talking to some teachers, they might start asking, like, who's Joe? How many cards does Joe have? They might ask that initial question, but kids want to know, like, what type of cards are they? What type of bag does Joe have? Are they My Little Pony cards? Is it a superhero bag? It's the most non-mathematical thing out there. And so as the teacher, I begin to start thinking, wait a minute, this is math class. Who cares about the My Little Pony cards? Who cares about the bags? And when all of this is happening, what we're doing is we're developing the context. And these are important things that students need to know before we actually dive into the mathematics. One of the things that I've learned since doing this is if it's important to a kid, it has to be important to me as the teacher. And so as kids begin to see this idea of developing the context, it becomes really powerful for them to understand what's happening. So as kids start asking questions, I begin to go ahead and start peeling away these Post-its and kind of undressing the problem as it stands. I think a lot of students would look at this problem and say it's too long, didn't read it, if it was all just in print because it's 5 lines. If you're a first grade teacher, it might take some of your kids half an hour to just read this very one problem alone. So yeah, here we're talking about the big piece, and then we begin to undress it. Dan talks about this process as patient problem solving. So what I'm going to have us do is we're going to watch this video, and if whether you're with a group of teachers or by yourself, you're going to need a blank piece of paper. I'm going to ask you a couple questions after we watch this video. So here we go. So you've just watched this video, and now I'm going to have you, with your group or with the people that you're with, maybe just jot down a couple little notes. Like when you watch that video, what did you notice? Talk to the people that you're with, or just kind of make a mental note of yourself. Give you about 30 seconds to do this. So some of the things that have been shared in the past when we start talking about what did you notice, some teachers might say there's a light bulb. The light bulb's being filled up with Skittles. The light bulb's being filled up with different colored Skittles. There's 5 different colors of Skittles. Lots of different noticing and wonders. And if we go back to that original picture that we saw where the Post-its were on that problem, what we're doing now is during the context of this problem, we're beginning to pull away the Post-its where the kids are truly seeing what's happening in that video. One thing that kids bring up when we do this problem is, I don't know if any of you noticed it, but there was a watch in the video. Yeah, not very mathematical, but it's things that kids notice. There was a hairy hand. There was also a wedding ring. And as students begin to write down and call all these things, I begin to write down these notes on the board of things that students are noticing. And if it's important to a kid, it has to be important to us. What I found is over time is as we begin doing these, I might say, whoa, this is not mathematical, and I keep trying to push this whole idea of, hey, we have math to do without ever addressing students and the wonders that they have. And so next time I ask students for a question, we might lose a couple more kids because they're going to be like, well, Mr. Fletcher, last time you asked me what I noticed, you didn't write down what I said, and therefore they begin to take themselves out of that question. So now that we've talked about what you notice, we've developed that context. What is it that you wonder? What is a question that you wonder? When you look at this light bulb, what do you wonder? Go ahead and share with the people that you're with, or just make a mental note. We'll go for maybe 15, 20 seconds. 30 seconds was pretty long here. So some people might say, is there the same number of each color? How many are there of each color? And some people might ask, well, how many Skittles are in the light bulb? And so all of these questions all of these wonderings start happening in the classroom, and we try and foster this idea of noticing and wondering. Now, if you're a kindergarten teacher or a first grade teacher, you know as well as I do that those kids never stop talking. It's continuous, it's ongoing, and it's beautiful. That the curiosity, the noticing, the wonder, it happens. It's intuitive to them. But then I can't help about if we're those of us who have been 5th grade teachers, that kids really just don't care anymore. Like they don't notice things, they don't wonder things in school. And so I think, where do kids spend the most of their waking hours between kindergarten and 5th grade, where in kindergarten, 1st grade, they're really curious. And by the time they leave us in 5th grade, they just don't care. So what are we doing to help foster and build and keep that wondering and noticing sustainable during the time that they're with us, and even beyond once they dive into middle school? So here's the question that I really want kids to try and get at. I'm going to try and guide them that way through questioning. And sometimes Dan that's just said today on Twitter, when I was looking on Twitter, is if kids don't come up with the question that he wants, he calls himself a member of the class community, and therefore he can also input his question. So, you know, whether you have to give the question, most of the time we want kids to come up with the question, but how many Skittles are in that light bulb? Go ahead and write it down. Share with the people that are at your table. How many Skittles do you think are in that light bulb? Go ahead. And go ahead and justify, like, why do you think there's that many in there? What's your reasoning? It's not just a matter of arbitrarily calling out some random number that you think, like, what's the reasoning? So we begin to dive into the standards of mathematical practice here. Like, justify and critique the reasoning of your buddy, or even yourself. So you have your estimate. You're invested right now, and if I shut down this webinar, like I don't come back. Some of you might be emailing me before I even make my way out to the car and leave the school today. You want to know the answer to this question. So you have this intellectual need of knowing, hey, what's happening here? So so you have your estimate. Most of the time, we're going to say, some of you have probably said like 43, 53, 60. Some of you might say 20, in which case you might be a little underestimating, but most of the time that's kind of the range that teachers will share. So now you need a little bit of information. What information could I, as a facilitator of this learning, give you as the participants of this learning that would help us figure out how many Skittles are in this light bulb? And so if we talk about the structure of a 3-act task, this is in Act 2, where you begin to identify the information. And as we work through these tasks, we'll tie it up in a minute, and what we're doing is this is that process of mathematical modeling. So as we work through this, you've estimated, and now you want to know some information, how many Skittles, you want to know how many there are of each Skittle. I'm going to give you that information right now. Yeah, there was a little bit of a sucker punch right there, and I would love to see, just by a show of hands, but I can't see your hands, how many of you underestimated, like drastically underestimated, how many Skittles were in there? And you'd probably want to change your estimate right now. But let's take a quick look at this. So there's the colors, and you might be saying, really, there's that many? I'll give you 20 seconds. Go ahead and figure out how many Skittles are in the light bulb there. And then, unlike traditional problems, I'm not just going to tell you the answer. I think most of us, being math teachers, could pretty much add this up relatively quickly. I'm going to release it in as a video. Yeah, I miscounted there, but we can fix that. We go back and revise our thinking. So yeah, we have 10 rows of 9 and 1 left over. So there's 91 Skittles. So now you come back and you think about your estimate. How close was your estimate? Like, if there was a chat, would you be giving yourself a thumbs up, 2 thumbs up, giving yourself like 2 big thumbs down? This whole idea of really beginning to incorporate estimation is a key piece of what mathematical modeling is. That's one reveal that you could share with your students, and then here's the other one that you could share with them. Just 2 different ways of showing the work to them, or showing that reveal. So again, there's a lot of power in that student seeing that multiple representation. So what we want to do now is now we're really going to dive into what this is about. There's the 3-act task, but why would we choose to use a 3-act task? So if we were to talk about the standards of mathematical practice, yep, there's 8 of them, but there's one in specific, which is kind of the title of this webinar here, is there's one in specific that is kind of true to my heart, and it has been true to my heart over the past maybe 4 or 5 years now, and that is model with mathematics. So it is probably the most misunderstood of all 8 standards of mathematical practice, whether you're a kindergarten teacher or whether you are a 12th grade teacher. So what is mathematical modeling, or what is modeling with mathematics? They're both kind of the same. They're synonymous, but
Graham, your sound went out. I don't know if you can hear me. This is Annie. I think the sound went out. Oh, you're back. The sound went out for a second. On your last slide, at the beginning of your last slide, the sound went out. So I don't know if you could go back to that one maybe.
Yeah, sure, great. Thanks, Annie. So this standard right here, so the SMP number 4, it's probably the most understood, it's the most misunderstood standard out of all 8 standards of mathematical practice. So a lot of the times I know when the standards first came out, this is the one that I had the toughest time wrapping my head around. So I would challenge you, like, what is mathematical modeling? What is modeling with mathematics? They're both kind of synonymous. They're the same. They're similar. Some people say modeling with math. Some people call it mathematical modeling. They're the same. But what I want to do here is not talk about what it is. I want to talk about what it isn't. So here's what mathematical modeling isn't. This is what standard number 4, when we talk about our SMPs, this is what it isn't. Just because we're using manipulatives alone doesn't ensure that mathematical modeling is taking place. And what that means is, just because you have kids that are working at a table using manipulatives, or because they're just graphing points, whether you're in middle school or high school, doesn't mean that they're modeling anything. It has to be taking place in a context. It has to be explaining something. A lot of the big misconception from this standard comes from it being a noun. Like, this is a model, where mathematical modeling, what it is talking about, it's talking about a verb. It's talking about the explaining of things that should be happening. And then the very last piece that mathematical modeling isn't, is it doesn't mean I do, you do, we do. So, like, I'm going to model for kids how to make sense of what's happening here. So a couple of years ago, I went to the definition of mathematical modeling, model with mathematics, in the Common Core Standards. This is what it said. Are there any words that stick out to you here? Hopefully there are some words, probably the ones that are bolded in white. But what I want you to think about is that Skittles task that we just did. We solved a problem in everyday life. You made assumptions and approximations. You did that when you estimated. You identified the important quantities. You did that when you said, hey, Graham, I need to know how many there is of each color Skittle. And then at the very end, you analyze those relationships. Like, you go back and you say, well, is my estimate right, or was my calculation off? And you interpret those mathematical results, and then you're reflecting on what just happened right there. So this is the modeling process. And in a paragraph, it might be a little bit tougher to understand. So as teachers, we like graphic organizers, or I know I do, and the teachers that I work with. So when we look at this graphic organizer here, we have a real world problem, and which is contextualized. When we come back and talk about that context that we were talking about right at the beginning, then we go ahead and we make assumptions and estimations. And then from there, we identify those missing variables, we define solution paths, and then we solve and interpret. Everything that's happening on the right-hand side of your screen, everything that's happening in that decontextualized place, that is where the mathematical modeling magic happens. And I can't help but think, as my time as a classroom teacher and just talking with teachers about mathematical modeling and how their understanding is growing, I think a lot of the times we do a really good job using real-world problems, but then once we have that real-world problem, we immediately jump down to defining a solution path. We skip the assumptions, we skip the estimations, we don't get kids to identify those important variables that they need to solve the problem, and in doing so, we take kids out of that mathematical modeling process. So this is what we're after with Standards 4. This is what we've been doing, thinking that we're getting to Standards 4. but we're really missing a lot of the understanding that, that should be happening. And so this is just generally speaking here. So so we've talked about that whole process of mathematical modeling. Just talking here, what is a 3-act task? This might be the first time that you've seen a 3-act task. If we look at that Skittles task that we did at the beginning, you posed the question. You wanted to know, the teacher is not the one asking the question, it's the students asking the question. You wanted to know how many Skittles are in that jar. You made estimates. That's all in Act 1. In Act 2, we identify the missing unknown variables. You start saying, hey, Graham, we need to know how many of each Skittle, each color Skittle there is. You plan a solution path, and then you solve and interpret the results. This structure that Dan Meyer came up with, it really helps highlight the important processes that should be taking place when we're engaging in mathematical modeling in our classrooms. Here's some questions that I most get when we start talking about modeling tasks, or I know Robert Kaplinski calls them problem-based learning lessons. Problem-based lessons, they're kind of the same, but how often should we use these tasks, or when should we use them? So I've found, and I think Robert would agree with me here, and Andrew Stidell as well, we kind of find that the number of tasks is really good if we're doing about 2 to 3 per unit. And when would you do these tasks? I think we want to do these tasks right at day 1 of a unit. So when you're about to launch a unit, put them through the ringer with one of these problems, because what it does is when you put this problem out there, well, your kids might not do so well with it, but here's the thing, you're going to allow all the misconceptions to step forward as students are beginning to dive into this process. So even if the kids can't do the math, you now know what they can and can't do before you dive into a unit. I found that when I would use these at the end of the unit, it's too late. I can't be reactive. I can't go ahead and fix the learning at the end of the unit. So I want to use these as a very powerful formative assessment piece. How long does one usually take? I really think that varies. In middle school and high school, I think it can take 2 days. I think you can knock some of them out in a single lesson. If you're in a kindergarten class, I think if you can keep, in some classes, if you can keep their attention for 20 minutes, great. And in which case, just break it up over 2 days. I think it really all depends on the class. And then the last piece here is what if we don't have the time? Like, Graham, have you seen the stuff that we have to teach? I don't have enough time to use a full lesson on one of these problems. And as you begin to dive in and use these tasks a little bit more, I hope that you'll find, just as I've found, that I don't have time to not have the time to use these tasks because of how powerful they are. So that kind of wraps up that whole process of mathematical modeling. And I'll be honest, I've worked a lot in my current role. I've worked in elementary schools, I've worked in middle schools, and in 9th grade is the only grade that I've worked with in high school. But the process of engaging kids in mathematical modeling through problem-based lessons or 3-act tasks, it doesn't change. And it shouldn't look any different whether you're in a kindergarten class or whether you're in a 9th or 10th grade class. The thinking that happens might be a little bit different, but the whole process and the way that students are engaging in mathematics doesn't really change. So one of the things I wanted to share is if this is the first time you've seen these tasks and you want to jump out there and try and get some more of them, I have quite a few on my website that go right from kindergarten through middle school. And then there's also these guys right here. So Dan Meyer, Robert Kaplinski, and Andrew Stidell are just three people that I go to frequently. But the good thing is that there's more and more people creating these tasks, and the more of us that create them, the more access that our kids will have to these deep, rich learning experiences that we know that they all deserve. Not on a daily basis, but we're not doing these tasks every day, but definitely the type of thinking that we want from our students. So yeah, with that being said, I hope it made sense. It was a little bit difficult here, making it a one-way conversation. I hope I didn't bore you to death. But if you have any questions, I'm going to kind of open that up now, Annie, to some questions. And if you just if you're like me and you go home and the questions keep turning through your mind and you have more questions, here's 3 ways that you can reach me. You can reach me through email, whether it be on Twitter if you do tasks. if you do one of these tasks, please, by all means, share with me the thinking that's happening. It's always great when we can learn and grow from each other. And then again, there's my blog. You can contact me through there. So yeah, I just want to go ahead and open it up now. If you have any questions about mathematical modeling, which I'm still really trying to build my understanding with, but then or 3-act tasks or problem-based learning, problem-based lessons.
Yeah, there's quite a few questions that came in for you. So, well, first of all, since you're sharing your screen right now and you have up your contact information, I just wanted to kind of make a plug for Twitter. So do you mind just taking a second to talk about how you, because, you know, I think that's one, either people are on it and they totally get what's going on, or they're kind of, this seems like a foreign world. And maybe, I don't know, I kind of found you through Math Twitter blogosphere. And so I don't know if you want to, can you just take a second and talk about the power of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Christopher Danielson, he's on Twitter. He's a college professor up in Minnesota, but also works with Desmos. He said it best, and he said Twitter is like the faculty lounge of your dreams. So you probably work at your building with some people that you have to go to a meeting with that you might not necessarily enjoy hanging out with all the time. But on Twitter, what you can do is you can learn from like-minded folks, and it's like just-in-time inventory for professional learning. So if I need something, so probably one of the best examples that I can personally use is a 7th grade teacher in my district had asked, hey Graham, I need some, or it was an 8th grade teacher, I need something for transformations. And so what I ended up doing is I went to Twitter and said, hey, I'm looking for some transformation lessons. And here's the thing, you're not having to go through all of these different websites, because the people that are on Twitter and the ones that my little faculty, it's vetted. So now we have people that are thinking like-minded, sharing resources together. They've been in the class and they're willing to share their experience. It's a really powerful community. The more that I jump on there, the more that I learn. I think it's fair to say that I've grown as much in 1 year because of Twitter that would take me to grow 3 years just through regular PD at my school. And again, I don't have to be there on it every day. It's there when I need it, which is super powerful. And that's how we can all collaborate and share tasks such as these.
And how do you pronounce the hashtag for Math Twitter blogosphere?
The age-old question. So, so some people, yeah, it's you can say it's MitBoss, just like MTBOS. MitBoss would be one way. MTBOS. I've heard some people call it the MT boss. You know what? And at the end of the day, who really cares what we're calling it? The big thing is that it's a community. So the fact that you're online engaging in a webinar, if you have a Twitter handle, or you have a blog, or you're just a math teacher, you're part of this community and you don't even know it. And it would be awesome if you're out there and you're not sure how to get connected, you could reach out to Annie, you could reach out to myself, and we'll just kind of show you the ropes and put you in a place and get you around some like-minded people that will help you grow and learn. And we're firm believers that all of us are smarter than one of us. So the more that we can lean on each other, the better off our kids are going to be.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So now I do have questions that are related to what you were talking about. So one instructional coach had a question. She said, you know, she works with a lot of teachers, and many of them might struggle with that balance of implementing their required curriculum and the additional resources. And you kind of touched on that a little bit, but how might you balance it if it really is a little bit of a gap in mindset between your administration? Like, how would you kind of sell it to them, or do you have any advice for kind of bridging that gap?
Yeah, and so I think that's a really good question, because it's important. We're having to shift mindsets. So there's two ways that you could look at that. I think the most powerful thing is seeing one done. So if you're going to go and work with teachers or model one of these tasks, or you have a great teacher that's already using them, invite your principal to maybe just come watch. And so therefore, I think when principals see the types of learning that kids are truly engaged in, I don't think that we can argue with the types of thinking that kids are doing. And then another thing is maybe talking to your principal. Say you have 4 weeks for a unit or 5 weeks for a unit, which is 20 days or 25 days, if you ask your principal if you can have one of those days to maybe try this task, let them know when you're going to do it. That way, if they ever did walk in, they know that you kind of asked for it up front. Because let's be honest, a lot of our administrators aren't necessarily math teachers or aware of a lot of the math teaching practices that many of us do know. So sometimes we just have to make them aware of it. That would kind of be the 2 ways that I would do it.
Yeah, great. Also, as somebody, when you were kind of talking about the idea of real-world problem, how do you find, somebody was asking, how do you find real-world problems that you think kids are going to be interested in?
So there's a really good website called 101 Questions, and you can kind of, if you were to, it's 101QS is the actual name of it. Dan Meyer has put it together, and it's kind of a crowdsourced website. And so what you can do is you can go on and you can look at these little videos, like when you're looking at the videos, which ones interest you, which ones pique your mind. And then something that we've talked about in the past is there's a lot of great people contributing to this community of 3-act tasks and problem-based lessons. I wouldn't necessarily worry about creating the tasks right now. I would focus more so on the implementation of it. And then once you begin to own the implementation, if you can find the time, then go ahead and create them. But I think if we focus on the implementation, or if you ever need a task, jump on Twitter, you can tweet, you can email me, say, hey Graham, I'm looking, this is my upcoming unit, I'm looking for, I need a task, can you point me in the right direction? So sometimes it's just getting hooked up to the right person and asking that question, but focus on the implementation and not necessarily on the creation. That's what I kind of suggest in terms of that.
And so do you suggest, somebody was asking, like, sometimes we might do a warm-up or some type of a activity that's not related to the content we're working on, and sometimes we want things that are related to the content we're working on. So do you always suggest doing 3-act tasks that are related to the unit that you're working on, or do you ever suggest mixing it up?
I can only speak from my experience. I'm really only going to do 3-act tasks that are in the unit that I'm working in. And the reason for being is because I don't necessarily give grades on them. I'm looking more at how students are engaging in the mathematical practices, and then I'm using those as formative assessment pieces. The amount of information I get from these, I want to try and leverage them as much as I possibly can. I don't want it to be just as a matter of, oh, I'm going to do a 3-act task today just to do a 3-act task. I want to be very purposeful in terms of the tasks that I select that will help drive my instruction moving forward.
Do you ever do more than one per unit? You kind of mentioned doing them at the beginning of the unit. Would there ever be instances, or what would be the purpose of doing another one midway through the unit or something like that?
Yeah, and I guess I said I'd do like 2 or 3 per unit, but I really only told you when I do one of them. Yeah, I normally do one in the beginning of a unit, and I'm pretty much always good to do one in the middle of the unit. So I'm able to see student growth over the span of that first half of the unit. So it might be one every 3 weeks, maybe at the end of 2 weeks. It kind of just depends on the unit, the length of a unit, and the learning that's taken place. But yeah, at the beginning of a unit and the middle of a unit for sure.
Great. There was a teacher that kind of made a connection when you were talking about the standard for mathematical practice and of modeling, and said that some of the things you were talking about also kind of felt closely tied to standard 2, which is to reason abstractly and quantitatively. So what do you think about that?
I couldn't agree more. And I think when we begin to look at the standards of mathematical practice, it's hard to isolate them. I think some of them can't stand alone. Like if we're reasoning abstractly and quantitatively, well, we're also attending to precision, or we hope in theory that they're attending to precision. What I found is that when I get students to engage in mathematical modeling, I'm really getting them to begin to engage in all 8. A lot of times one standard alone can't pull in all 8 standards. Standard 4, for it to happen, we really need to pull in all 8. It's probably the most inclusive out of all of the standards. You can't do 4 without doing 1 through 3 and 5 through 8.
Do you ever give feedback, or, I mean, I guess some people sort of grade or give some type of, I don't know, assessment on the mathematical practices?
Yeah, and so we'll talk about, like, basically what we're always doing is we're looking at standards, and personally, I'm looking at standards 1, 3, and 6. So are students problem solving? Are they critiquing the reasoning of others? And if they're doing that, then they're probably engaging in standard 2. But it's standards 1, 3, and 6. Those are the 3 that we're continually assessing, and our students are really familiar with. And if we focus on those 3, we can really hit at multiple standards. Those are the 3 that most of our students know that we're continually looking for.
Okay. Somebody kind of going back to when you do them in the unit, a teacher was wondering, do you ever repeat the same 3-act tasks to show improvement within a unit?
Yeah, great question. So a couple thoughts on that there. We might do a task at the beginning part of the unit, and then we don't show the reveal, and then we'll collect the task. And after we collect the task, maybe in 2-3 weeks, we'll give the kids back the exact same sheet, and then we'll have them go with a different colored pen or pencil. And when they do that, you can now show growth. Like, hey, what would you change based on your thinking? So now students, or they might take a blank piece of paper and staple it to their old one. So what you've done now is you've been able to capture student growth through the same task, but by just not showing the reveal and collecting them. And then kids then know, well, we're going to give this back to you in 2 weeks. Let's show how your thinking has grown. And so when we let students know that, it really helps them, and they'll come back and say, whoa, my learning really sucked at the beginning of a unit, but now look at how much I've grown. And so when we start talking about building confidence in students, that's definitely a powerful tool. I know one of the things that teachers will say is, well, I need to get a grade from this. So what we might do is we might do this task, and then the next day I might just give students 5 numbers, just 5 numbers alone, give them a Post-it and say, go ahead and answer this before we start. And we'll just do a quick ticket out the door or a ticket in the door. And now I can see which students have it, which students don't, which students are good at the computation piece of it, because we've done all the mathematizing and the mathematical understanding the previous day. I just want to see if they can do the computation as it stands in the standard.
I really like your idea of having them use another color to kind of show their growth on the same task, and it kind of made me think back to the question that somebody was asking about justifying it to administration or something. You know, just kind of having that evidence of student learning might be another piece to kind of show your administration.
Yeah, it's powerful when it comes back to capturing that student growth. And you know what, I think that kind of settles the nerves of a lot of parents as well. Because we're not just giving them a grade, we're saying this is what your student could do, and this is what they're doing now, which is a really powerful tool for teachers, for parents, for students, and also for administrators when we start showing them the growth. For those administrators that might be reluctant to maybe start stepping away from a traditional curriculum.
Are there any common pitfalls, like when you see a teacher first implement a 3-act task, is there anything that stands out to you as something that you see happen often that kind of throws it off the rails, or maybe a teacher goes, oh, that didn't work? Any words of advice if you were going to try one of these tomorrow?
I think the noticing and the wondering. So if you've never done one of these with your students before, when you begin to ask, what do you notice, what do you wonder, just know that it might not go so well. I think most teachers that have had success with 3-act tasks know that it might take maybe 2 of them, maybe 3 of them to really get kids noticing and wondering. But once students know, they start doing it everywhere, which is awesome. One of the best things is kids now don't shut off their mind. They start noticing things when they're walking to the cafeteria. Oh, Mr. Fletcher, you know what I noticed yesterday when I was at home? I know my daughters, I have a 10 and 7-year-old daughters, they create their own 3-act tasks at home just because that's something that they enjoy doing. Mind you, they have a mom and dad who are teachers. But when we start doing the noticing and wondering, it'll be different because we're asking kids to think differently than what we always have. It's not traditional. But what it does is it's preparing them for that unknown. Like we don't know what types of jobs will be around when they graduate in 15, 20 years.
Yeah, good point. So something that comes up often, I think especially in elementary grades, is people are trying to just come up with what structure works best for younger learners. And so it's kind of an ongoing conversation of personalization, whole class, stations, small group work, mini lessons. So of those different structures, how do you see those kind of fitting in the elementary classroom?
Can you just repeat that question, Annie? I think you jumped out. Jumped out there.
Yeah, sure. I said, sometimes when I'm working with elementary teachers, they're asking me about the kind of different structures to do with younger learners. So when should I do stations? When should I have full group conversations? When should I do a mini lesson? When should I pull small groups for intervention? What about personalization? Those kind of questions of structure.
Yeah, and so whenever we'll do 3-act tasks, I can only speak from my experience and the teachers that I know that have had success with them. And there could be someone that would say something completely different. I'll only use these whole group because I think we lose something from that communication, that socialization of the math class. We're going to try and do this whole group, and then from the information that we get from it now helps me set up my small group. So when we take all the student work at the end of the day, and we've already discussed it, and we've closed and we've wrapped up the lesson, I'm looking at what students are using similar strategies, and that will then inform how I'm doing my small groups. And then once I have my small groups, I'm able to see. So for instance, take the example of the Skittles. You're going to have some kids in your class that are going to draw out 91 Skittles, but using the 5 different colors. Well, that's okay in first grade, maybe, but the problem is that we still have kids in 4th and 5th grade that are doing that. So what are we doing to move kids away from that? So, but then again, you're going to have some kids that are going to decompose the numbers into 10s and 1s. And then if you're in 4th grade, you might have some students that are able to collectively add up the numbers by doing partial sums. So I think by getting the student work will help drive the decisions that we make. But when we're doing these tasks, I find it takes a full period, so we're not really having an opportunity to dive into small groups. I might put them in small groups while we do the task, but we won't be doing follow-up, remediation, intervention until I know where their thinking stands.
Great. That's kind of it. Oh, no, wait, maybe a few more here. Somebody said, I love the be less helpful phrase. How does one explain this to parents, or should I put it in a more diplomatic way? And then how does one do that?
Yeah, I think if you, okay, there was a recent study that came out, and it said like 68%, I think it was 68%. So if you're a kindergarten teacher, 68% of the jobs that exist when your students graduate from high school don't exist today. So like none of us that are in this webinar, none of us went to school saying, hey, I want to be a social media marketer, or I want to be a website designer. So by being less helpful, we're not showing kids how to necessarily get the answers for the sake of getting the answers. What we're doing is we're trying to get students to engage in those 8 standards of mathematical practice. It's not saying that we don't want kids to be right, and it's not saying that we don't want kids to be efficient thinkers. What it's saying is that we want kids to work through a productive struggle, because after they leave us, mom and dad, unfortunately, they won't be spoon-fed for the rest of their life. Like being an adult, like it's tough work. And so if we can begin to create students and foster that environment where students learn to problem solve and reason by themselves, then those are the skills that they need, whether they're in kindergarten or whether they're in 10th grade. And so I think by letting parents know that we're being less helpful, but telling them why we're not being less helpful, it's not just saying, hey, do it yourself. It's very purposeful in the areas of how we're being less helpful. We're not going to spoon feed our children the answers and the information that they need.
Yeah. Do you ever give advice to parents about how they might be less helpful? You know, I think somebody actually on the webinar right now says, you know, like when you have those kitchen table conversations with their parents and, you know, they're in 2nd grade and they come back all of a sudden knowing the subtraction algorithm and you've only been doing base 10 blocks, you know, like how do we help parents be a little less helpful? Have you ever had those kind of conversations?
Yeah, so there's two things, two thoughts that come to mind. The first one that comes to mind is John Stevens just created, and he does like a newsletter with it's called Table Talk Math, and it's things that students can do at home with their parents and ways that parents can engage their kids just through regular conversations. Yeah, it's John Stevens. It's Table Talk Math. Well, he has a book, but he also just does a free newsletter. So maybe sharing and taking some of the ideas that he has in his newsletter, and if you find them useful, then you can begin to incorporate more of those. And Annie, here's a shameless plug here. At the beginning, you talked about the progression videos. I've found that those have been extremely helpful for parents, in part because parents they only know the algorithm. They understand counting, and they understand algorithms. They don't understand all the smaller nuances that need to be happening. So by sharing those progression videos with parents, we show them that the algorithm is a means to an end and that we'll get there, but there's so much understanding that needs to take place. So I found that those progression videos have been really, and when parents see them, they're like, okay, wait a minute, I see where it's going, I can see the understanding, and everyone's talking a common language. I found that those progressions really help settle the nerves of parents.
Yeah, awesome. I'm just typing that into the chats for everybody. I'm like trying to keep up with all the resources that you're sharing, and just to let everyone know, we said to follow up email, and I'll put links to all of these awesome resources that you've shared, because I know there's been a lot that you've shared that's been really good.
Yeah, I just jumped back. So you see where the 3-act tasks are. Right next to that is a progression video. So there's one for addition, subtraction, multiplication, one for division, one for fractions, and one for early counting. And I think it's really good for us as teachers to be speaking common language. I don't think even with the people that are at our grade levels, I find a lot of the times teachers on our own grade levels have different understandings of how things should be taught. And so what these videos have done is they're taken from the progression documents that were kind of the underpinning understanding that happened when the standards were being wrote. And so it's all aligned to the understanding that should be taking place based on our standards. But you have the 3-act tasks, and then right next to that are the progression videos, and that's where you can find those.
I've noticed before that there's not necessarily 3-act tasks for any of the geometry standards. Do you think they don't work as well with the geometry standards, or are they just more in the works?
Yeah, geometry is for me personally, geometry is a tough one to kind of wrap my head around. I find it fits very well with measurement and data, but in terms of geometry, yeah, I need to start chewing on that one a little bit more. When I look around, I don't see geometry. It's there, but I don't necessarily see it. But that's a kindergarten standard, which is pretty crazy, where we need to see things in the environment. But yeah, I have never created one.
Yeah. Well, I'll just, give you a little project to work on. Like, you don't have enough things, right?
Absolutely. Add one more thing to the list.
Well, this has been so amazing. Is there anything else that you wanted to, mention, or anything else that came up as you were answering all these questions?
No, I don't think so. I think the big thing is you kind of mentioned jumping on Twitter and kind of connecting yourself around like-minded people. I don't think that all the questions could be answered, and I don't think all of them would be answered today. I know I don't necessarily have all the answers, but I think the more that we can collectively lean on each other, the better off our kids will be, for sure. Yeah, the more we can all just ask each other questions and learn and grow from each other, the better off it'll be for our kids. And so I hope I've empowered some of you today, just maybe even a little bit. And if you have any questions for me, I can help out. And if I don't have the answers, we'll find someone who does.
Yeah, definitely. And there was a teacher that asked if maybe we could do a webinar about how to use Twitter or how to get on Twitter. So I think that's a great idea. Maybe it could be one of something during the summer or in the fall. So
yeah, add it to your list.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hopefully. Let's see, did it go to me? There we go. All right, and we're going to go ahead and finish up here because we're almost out of time, but thank you again to Graham. Really appreciate it. I'm definitely an Edu fan, and I really enjoyed having a chance to moderate and get everyone's questions answered, and also just get some of my own questions answered, so I really appreciate it. So as a reminder to people that are still with us right now, think about joining ICTM. Again, it's how we can bring things like this to you, like our webinar. There will be a survey at the end of this if you could take a second to fill that out. I do read through all the comments, and we really appreciate getting some feedback, so we would love to get that. And then hopefully we will see you at NCTM Regional. And like I mentioned, registration is open, so consider getting some friends together and joining us. So thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you later.